The rain had been falling since dawn, a steady grey curtain that turned the lanes to mud and the river beyond the village into a swollen, hungry thing. Merrin Ashcombe stood at the edge of the small stone bridge and watched the water rush beneath it, brown and thick with broken branches. She held her bonnet tight against her head with one hand. The other clutched a basket of bread and eggs that she had promised to bring to old Mrs. Penrose down the lane. Her boots were soaked through. Her stockings had been wet for so long she had stopped noticing the cold in her toes. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a country parson who had died the winter before, and she lived now on the charity of an aunt who did not much care for her. She had learned to be quiet. She had learned to be useful. She had learned that when a room was full of people, the best place to stand was near the window, where the light did not fall on her face. She crossed the bridge and turned onto the path that ran along the riverbank. The wind pushed at her skirts. Somewhere behind the low grey clouds, the sun was trying and failing to come out. The smell of wet earth was thick in her nose, and under it something colder, the metal smell of the river itself. She thought about Mrs. Penrose's small warm kitchen and the kettle that would already be singing. She thought about the walk back, which would be worse if the rain grew heavier. She did not think about herself at all. She had not thought much about herself in a long time. The path curved down to a small wooden landing where the village folk kept their flat-bottomed boats. Two men were there in the rain, one older, one younger, arguing in low voices. A small boy stood between them, no more than 4 years old, with dark curls plastered to his forehead and a wet blue coat that was too big for him. The boy was crying without making much sound. He held the older man's coat in his small fist. Maren slowed her step. She did not know these men. They were not from the village. Their clothes were finer than the farmer's clothes, though the older man wore a plain black coat that looked like a servant's dress. His Grace said the boy was to come with us, the older man was saying. The current is nothing today. I have crossed in worse. His Grace also said to use your head, the younger man answered. His voice was tight. Look at the water. Look at it. The older man looked. Maren looked too. The river was moving fast, faster than she had ever seen it. Whole branches were sweeping past. A dead sheep bumped against a rock and rolled onward. The younger man shook his head and stepped back from the landing. I will not take the child across in that. Then I will take him myself. The older man's voice had gone hard. He lifted the boy under the arms and set him in the small flat boat that was tied at the landing. The boy did not cry louder. He only looked up at the older man with the still, watchful face of a child who has already learned that his opinion does not count. Maren felt something turn over in her chest. She stepped closer. The rain ran down her face. She did not know what to say. It was not her business. She had been taught, over and over again, that other people's business was not hers to speak on. Sir, she said. Her voice was small. Both men turned. Sir, the water. It is very high. The older man looked at her. His eyes were pale and impatient. And who are you, girl? No one, sir, I only thought. Then do not think. Move along. She should have moved along. That was what she had always done. She had been moving along her whole life. But the boy was looking at her now, over the older man's shoulder, and his small hand was still tight in the coat, and she could not make her feet turn back toward the path. She stood in the rain and watched the older man untie the rope. She watched him step into the boat. She watched him take up the pole that was meant to push them across the river, though the river was moving so fast that no pole would hold. The younger man on the shore called out, Barrow, do not. But the older man, whose name was Barrow, pushed off. The boat slid out into the current. For a moment it seemed to move properly, the pole biting the bottom, the small craft turning to face the far bank. Then a great branch struck the side. The boat spun. Barrow staggered. The boy fell against the wooden bench and cried out at last, a real cry, high and thin over the sound of the rushing water. The pole came out of Barrow's hands. The boat spun again. And then, with a slow, terrible ease, it tipped. It happened in a breath. The bottom of the boat rose up out of the water like the back of some great fish. Barrow went under with a shout that ended before it began. The boy went under without a shout at all. The blue coat flashed once, small and bright, and then it was gone into the brown water. The younger man on the shore shouted. He ran 3 steps and stopped, because he did not know how to swim, and because the river was already carrying the overturned boat away. He turned in a helpless circle. He shouted a name that Maren did not catch. He shouted it again. The boat capsized in the storm with the child still aboard, and Maren dove in without hesitation. She did not remember dropping the basket. She did not remember unpinning her bonnet, though it must have gone somewhere because she felt the cold rain full on her hair. She only remembered the moment before she jumped, the strange slow moment when she stood at the edge of the landing and saw the blue coat in the water, and something inside her, something that had been quiet for a very long time, said now. Her heart was beating hard. Her hands were shaking. She could hear her own breath, and then she was in the air, and then she was in the water, and the cold hit her like a hand across the face. She had learned to swim as a child in the pond behind her father's church. He had insisted on it. He had said a girl who could not swim was a girl who could not save herself, and by extension a girl who could not save anyone else. She had not thought about her father's lessons in 5 years. She thought about them now. She kicked hard against the pull of the current. Her skirts wrapped around her legs like heavy weeds. She got her head above the water and gasped, and saw the blue coat 2 body lengths downstream, bobbing once, sinking. She kicked. She reached. Her hand closed on wet wool. She pulled the small body up against her chest and tipped her head back and gasped again. The boy was limp. His eyes were closed. His mouth was open and full of river water. She turned onto her back with him on her chest, the way her father had shown her, and she kicked toward the bank, and the current fought her every inch, and she did not stop. The younger man on the shore was running now along the bank, keeping pace with her, shouting. She could not make out his words. Her ears were full of water and her own heartbeat. She saw a low branch hanging out over the river ahead. She kicked harder. She reached up with one arm, holding the boy tight with the other. Her hand caught the branch. She held. The current pulled at her legs and tried to take her, and she held. The younger man came scrambling down the bank and stretched himself out flat on the wet earth, and reached down and caught her wrist. He pulled. She pulled. Together they dragged her and the child up out of the water and onto the muddy grass. She rolled the boy onto his side. She pressed against his small back with the flat of her hand. Water came out of his mouth. She pressed again. More water came. She turned him and put her ear against his chest. She could hear nothing over the rain and her own gasping. She pressed her mouth over his and breathed, the way her father had once made her practice on a drowned lamb. And she had thought at the time that it was a strange thing to make a girl practice, and now she thanked her father in her heart with every breath she gave. She breathed. She pressed his chest. She breathed again. The boy coughed, a great choking cough. More water came out of him. He drew a real breath, thin and shaking, and then he began to cry. And Maren sat back in the mud and put her hands over her face and shook. The younger man was kneeling beside her. His face was white. God in heaven, he was saying. God in heaven, miss, you saved him. You saved him. Barrow, she said through her hands. The other man. The younger man looked at the river. The overturned boat was already a small dark shape a long way downstream. There was no sign of Barrow. The younger man closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he opened them and picked up the crying child and wrapped him inside his own coat. We must get him warm, he said. His voice was rough. We must get him to his grace. Miss, can you walk? She lowered her hands and looked at him. She was shaking so hard her teeth clacked together. Yes, she said. Yes, I can walk. He helped her to her feet. She swayed. He caught her elbow. Together, the 3 of them stumbled up the bank and along the muddy path, the child crying softly against the young man's shoulder, Maren with her wet skirts clinging to her legs and her hair streaming water down her back. She did not know where they were going. She did not ask. She only walked. They came at last to a place she did not know. A great pair of iron gates set in a long stone wall, and beyond the gates a drive of pale gravel, and beyond the drive a house so large that she stopped in the road and stared. She had heard of Renmer. Everyone in the county had heard of Renmer. It was the seat of the Duke of Renmer, whose family had owned the land as long as anyone could remember, and whose current master had come back from the wars a widower with one small son and a face they said, that did not know how to smile. She had never in her life expected to walk up that drive. The young man was already running, the child in his arms. Merrin followed, her boots squelched with each step. The great front doors opened before they reached them, as if someone had been watching for them, and a tall, thin butler with a face like grey stone stepped out and drew in his breath sharply at the sight of the wet child. "Master Tobias," he said. "He is alive," the young man said. "Fetch his grace, fetch Dr. Weld, fetch dry clothes, and fetch this young woman a blanket." She pulled him from the river. The butler moved. Servants appeared as if from nowhere. Merrin was suddenly wrapped in a heavy wool blanket that smelled of lavender and cedar. She was drawn into a great hall with a floor of black and white stone. A fire burned in a fireplace big enough to stand in. She was led toward it. She held the blanket close. She could not stop shaking. And then a door at the far end of the hall opened, and a man came through it, and every servant in the room shifted slightly, not from fear, from habit. He was tall. He was not, Merrin thought at once, what people meant when they said handsome. His face was too hard for that, the lines around his mouth too deep. The black hair at his temples already touched with grey, though he could not have been much more than 30. He walked without hurrying, and yet he seemed to cross the hall in a moment. He looked at the young man, and at the crying child in the young man's arms, and his face did not change at all. Only his eyes changed. They went to the child and stayed there. "Give him to me." The young man handed the child over. The Duke of Renmere took his son against his chest. The child buried his wet face in his father's neck. For a long moment the Duke stood in the middle of his own hall with his son in his arms and did not move, and did not speak. Merrin looked away. It felt like something she should not see. When she looked back, the Duke was looking at her. "Corbin," he said, without taking his eyes from her. "Tell me." The young man Corbin told him. He told it plainly, in the flat voice of a man who is not yet done being frightened. He told about Barrow's stubbornness. He told about the pole. He told about the branch. He told about Merrin standing on the landing, and the way she had said, "No one, sir," when Barrow asked her name, and the way she had jumped without asking permission or waiting to be praised. The Duke listened without moving. When Corbin finished, the Duke was quiet for what felt to Merrin like a very long time. She could hear the fire snap. She could hear the rain against the tall windows. She could hear her own breath, still uneven. "Barrow," the Duke said. "Gone, Your Grace. I am sorry." The Duke closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked at Merrin again. "Your name?" "Merrin Ashcombe, Your Grace." "Ashcombe, the parson's daughter." "Yes, Your Grace. He died last year. I remember him. He preached the sermon at my wife's funeral." She did not know what to say to that. She said nothing. The Duke nodded, once, as if her silence had been the correct answer. "Mrs. Halley," he said, and a small round woman with a bunch of keys at her belt appeared as if she had been standing there all along. "Miss Ashcombe is soaked through. Put her in the green room. Send up hot water and dry clothes. She will not be leaving tonight." "Your Grace, I cannot," Merrin said. "My aunt. She will expect me. Word will be sent to your aunt. You will not walk 5 miles in wet clothes in this rain after what you have done. I do not permit it." He did not say it unkindly. He did not say it kindly either. He simply said it, the way a man says that the sun rises in the east, and she understood without being told that no one in this house argued with the Duke of Renmere when he spoke in that voice. She lowered her eyes. She nodded. The small round woman with the keys took her elbow gently and led her toward a staircase, and as Merrin climbed she looked back once, and the Duke was still standing in the middle of his great hall with his son in his arms, and he was watching her go. The green room was warm and smelled of dried rose petals. A fire had already been laid. 2 young maids brought a copper tub and jugs of steaming water. Merrin sat on the edge of a chair in her wet clothes and could not seem to make her fingers work the buttons. One of the maids, a kind-faced girl of about her own age, knelt down and helped her without being asked. Merrin whispered her thanks. The maid smiled and said, "Miss, you saved the little master. There is no thanks in this house you cannot ask for." She sank into the hot water. She thought she might weep, but she did not. She scrubbed the river out of her hair with sharp-smelling soap. She let her head rest against the copper edge of the tub and closed her eyes. When she opened them, dry clothes had been laid on the bed. A plain gown of soft grey wool that fit her well enough, though it must have belonged to someone taller, and clean stockings and soft slippers. She dressed slowly. Her hands were still weak. She did not know what to do next. She sat on the edge of the great bed and looked at her hands. A knock came at the door. It was the small round woman with the keys, Mrs. Halley. She had brought a tray. There was bread on it, and butter, and a thick soup that steamed, and a small pot of tea. "His Grace asked that you eat, miss," Mrs. Halley said. "He said you were not to feel obliged to come down. He said you had done enough today. How is the child?" "Sleeping. Dr. Weld says he will do very well. There is no fever." Mrs. Halley paused. She looked at Marin with a strange, soft expression that Marin did not know how to read. "You must not mind His Grace, miss. He does not always know how to speak to people. But he is a good man. Barrow was with him 15 years. I am so sorry about Barrow. So is he, miss, so are we all." Mrs. Halley left. Marin ate a little of the soup. She could not eat much. She lay down on top of the great bed in her borrowed grey gown and looked at the painted ceiling and listened to the rain. And somewhere in the middle of listening she fell asleep so deeply that she did not dream at all. She woke to a grey morning. The rain had stopped. Through the window she could see the wet lawn and a stand of oaks and, in the distance, the river. Brown and still angry but shrunk back inside its banks. Someone had come into the room in the night and built up the fire. Her old clothes had been taken away. Her boots stood by the hearth, cleaned and stuffed with paper to hold their shape. She sat up. She did not know what time it was. She did not know whether she was expected to go down or to wait. She went to the window and stood with her hand on the cold glass and looked at the river and thought about a small blue coat sinking, and she pressed her hand harder against the glass until her fingers went white. A quiet knock. The kind maid from the night before, whose name was Peggy, brought her hot water and a comb and helped her put up her hair. Peggy did not chatter. Peggy simply worked. When she was finished, she said, "His Grace asks if you will breakfast with him, miss, in the small dining room. I am to take you down." "With him?" "Yes, miss." Marin followed Peggy through corridors hung with paintings of men on horses and women in stiff, old-fashioned gowns. She was led into a room much smaller than the great hall, with pale yellow walls and a fire, and one long window that looked over a garden of clipped hedges. The Duke of Renmere was already there. He stood by the window with a cup of tea in his hand. He turned when she came in. "Miss Ashcombe." "Good morning. Please, sit. There were only 2 places set at the table." She sat where he pointed. A servant poured her tea. There was toast, and eggs, and a small dish of berries, and cold ham, and none of it looked as if she should touch it, though her stomach was suddenly very hungry. "Eat," the Duke said. He sat opposite her. "You have not eaten properly since yesterday morning, I would wager." She ate. She did not know how to talk to him, so she did not try. He did not seem to expect her to. He drank his tea and watched the garden through the window. Once he said, without turning, "Tobias asked for you when he woke." She set down her fork. "How is he this morning?" "He is well. He is loud. He is asking questions about the horses. His nurse cannot keep him in bed." He turned then and looked at her, and there was the smallest change at the corner of his mouth, not a smile. Only the memory of where a smile might once have lived. He asked whether the lady who caught him was still here. I said yes. He said he would like to see her. "I would like to see him too, Your Grace." After breakfast, then, they ate in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. She noticed that he ate slowly and drank his tea without sugar, and that he watched her hands more than her face. As if he were reading something there she did not know she had written. When he finally spoke again, it was of nothing important. The weather. The state of the roads. The fact that the miller's wife had had another child. She answered him briefly and truthfully. He seemed to like brief and truthful answers. After breakfast, he took her himself up the wide stairs and down a long corridor to a bright, airy nursery, where a small boy in a fresh white shirt was sitting up in a bed too large for him, being read to by an old woman with grey braids. The boy looked up when the door opened. He saw his father. Then he saw Maren. His whole face changed. "You," he said. He held out both small arms. She went to him. She did not think. She sat on the edge of the bed and took his small, warm hands in hers. He looked at her very seriously. "You got me out of the water." "Yes, I was scared." "I know. I was scared too. Papa says thank you." He glanced at his father, then back at her. "I say thank you." "You are very welcome, Tobias." He leaned forward and put his forehead against her shoulder. Small and trusting, and completely without shame, and she put her arms around him and closed her eyes. She did not see the Duke's face. She did not know that he had turned away and gone to stand at the window with his back to them. She did not know that he stood there for a long time. When she left the nursery, the Duke walked with her back down the stairs. In the great hall he stopped. "My carriage will take you home. Mrs. Hallie has packed a basket. There are some things in it. Do not refuse them. Your Grace, I did not do it for reward. I know that. That is why you cannot refuse them." She did not know what to say to this. She looked at her borrowed slippers. "Miss Ashcombe." She looked up. He was watching her again with that same steady gaze, as though he was still trying to read whatever he thought was written on her. "You have my thanks. And you have my house. If ever there is anything you require, you have only to send word. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Your Grace. I do not say such things lightly. I believe you, Your Grace." He nodded. He held out his hand. She hesitated. He waited. She put her hand in his. It was warm and dry and very steady. He held her hand for exactly 1 moment longer than politeness required. Then he let go. The carriage carried her home. Her aunt met her at the door with a face like sour milk and 100 questions and no interest whatever in the answers. Maren answered as briefly as she could. She unpacked the basket. There was tea in it, and sugar, and a whole ham, and a length of good wool cloth in a soft blue that would make a warm winter gown, and at the very bottom of the basket, wrapped in tissue paper, a small green leather book of Psalms with her father's name inside the front cover. She sat down on the edge of her narrow bed and held the book to her chest, and finally, at last, she wept. Her aunt was a woman named Mrs. Hollis, the sister of Maren's dead mother, who had taken Maren in after the parson's death because it would have looked ill not to, and because she had a use for a quiet young woman who could copy letters and mend linen and never eat much. She had 4 daughters of her own, all older than Maren, and all married or nearly so. And she had spent the better part of the last year making it plain that Maren was not to expect a season in town, or new gowns, or any of the small hopes a girl of 23 might reasonably still hold. Maren had accepted this. She had not argued. She had simply gone quiet, in the way she had learned to go quiet in her father's last months when he had needed the house to be still. Mrs. Hollis did not believe the story of the river at first. She said Maren must have exaggerated. She said no duke gave a length of blue wool to a parson's daughter for pulling a child from a stream. She said Maren was not to speak of it to the neighbours, because it would look forward and vulgar. And then, 4 days after Maren came home, a footman in the Renmer livery rode up to Mrs. Hollis's small stone house with a folded letter on a silver tray, and after that, Mrs. Hollis said a great many other things instead. The letter was from the Duke. It was short. It said that Master Tobias had been asking after Miss Ashcombe every day, and that his father would consider it a personal favour if Miss Ashcombe could be spared for an afternoon each week to visit the child during his recovery, and that a carriage would be sent. It was signed only with a single letter, a hard black G that Maren traced with her fingertip and could not stop looking at. "Gideon, Mrs." Hollis said, reading over her shoulder, in a voice suddenly full of a warmth Maren had never heard from her. "The Duke's given name is Gideon. Of course you must go, my dear. Of course. What an honour. What an extraordinary honour." Maren went. She went the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that, and the one after that. Each time the carriage came and took her the 5 miles to Renmere, and each time she was received by Mrs. Hallie and taken up to the nursery, and each time Tobias climbed into her lap and asked her to tell him a story about the river, and each time she told him instead a story about a brave rabbit, or a foolish fox, or a girl who lived in the moon. Because she did not think a small boy needed to keep hearing about the water. The Duke was not always at home when she came. When he was, he did not always come to the nursery. But sometimes he did. He would appear in the doorway with a book in his hand or a letter, and he would stand and watch his son on her lap for a moment. And then he would come and sit in the second chair by the fire and listen to the end of the story, and afterward he would walk her back down to the carriage himself. On the fourth Wednesday, he said, "You are not what I expected." She was pulling on her gloves. She looked up. "What did you expect, Your Grace? I expected a girl who would come here to be seen, to be noticed, to be admired for what she had done. You do not talk about it. You do not even look pleased when Tobias thanks you. I do not need to be thanked. I know, that is what I mean." He looked at her for a long moment. "You do not need very much from anyone, Miss Ashcombe. Do you?" She did not know what to say. It felt like an accusation and a compliment at the same time. She said, "At last I have learned not to." He looked away out the tall window. "That is a hard lesson. It is not a bad one." "No," he said quietly. "It is not a bad one. But it is a hard one." He handed her into the carriage himself that day. When his hand closed briefly around hers, she felt again that he held it one moment longer than politeness required. The autumn came on. The leaves in the great oaks at Wrenmere turned to copper. Tobias was fully well again and had gone back to riding his fat little pony under Corbyn's watchful eye. Merrin still came every Wednesday. It was understood now. It was a thing that simply was. Mrs. Hollis's daughters, who had returned home for the harvest, watched Merrin go each week with expressions that Merrin could not read, but did not much like. The oldest of the four daughters was a woman named Prudence, who had married a wine merchant and was, at 29, already the mother of 3. Prudence was a handsome woman with hard grey eyes and a great deal of jewellery and a habit of speaking in a voice pitched to carry. She had, from the first day of Merrin's arrival at her mother's house, treated Merrin with the particular gentle cruelty of a woman who has decided that another woman's quietness is proof of her stupidity. She corrected Merrin's manners at dinner. She laughed at Merrin's country accent, which was in fact her own. She had once, in front of guests, said that it was so nice to have cousin Merrin in the house because it was rather like having a very patient sort of dog. Prudence did not care for the Wednesday carriage. She said nothing at first. She only watched. Then, on the evening after the 6th Wednesday, at a small dinner Mrs. Hollis was giving for the vicar and his wife and one or two of the better neighbours, Prudence chose her moment. The table had reached the meat course. The candles were lit. The room smelled of roasted mutton and warm wine and the faint sweet smoke of the fire. Mrs. Hollis had over the last month worked the story of the river into every conversation she could, and she had brought it out again for the vicar. The vicar's wife made appropriate sounds. Prudence lifted her glass and looked over its rim at Merrin, who was, as always, seated near the end of the table by the window. "It is a very touching story," Prudence said, in her carrying voice. "Really, cousin, it is. Only I do wonder." "Wonder what, my dear?" Mrs. Hollis asked, uneasily. She knew her daughter's voice. "Whether it is quite fair to keep taking the Duke's carriage every week. It has been, what, 6 weeks now? 7? The child is quite well, we hear. Everyone hears. It seems to me that a girl of taste would have stopped going after the second visit. Otherwise one begins to look. Well," she smiled. She sipped her wine. "One begins to look like a girl who is trying to marry a duke on the strength of a wet skirt." The table went very still. The vicar's wife looked at her plate. The vicar cleared his throat and said nothing. Mrs. Hollis opened her mouth and closed it. Merrin felt the heat come up her neck. She set down her fork very carefully on the edge of her plate. She did not cry. She did not argue. She looked at Prudence for a long moment across the candles, and Prudence looked back at her with the small, satisfied face of a woman who has landed exactly the blow she intended. And then Merrin stood up. She did it slowly. She smoothed her skirt with her hands. She curtsied to her aunt, and then to the vicar's wife, and then, after a small deliberate pause, she curtsied to Prudence. "Please excuse me," she said, in a voice so calm that it seemed to belong to someone else. "I find I am not hungry after all." She walked the length of the room. She did not hurry. She could feel every eye on her back. She closed the door behind her without slamming it. She climbed the narrow back stairs to her small room under the eaves, and she sat down on the edge of her bed, and she did not weep. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at them and breathed. She did not go down again that night. In the morning she rose early, packed a small carpet bag with her few clothes, and her father's book of Psalms, and the length of blue wool she had never made up into a gown, and walked the 2 miles to the village. She went to Mrs. Penrose, the old woman she had been carrying bread and eggs to the day of the storm. Mrs. Penrose lived alone in a cottage with 2 rooms and a leaking roof, and had told Marin more than once that if she ever needed a place, there was a place. Marin asked if the offer still held. Mrs. Penrose put on the kettle and said it did. Marin wrote 2 letters that morning at Mrs. Penrose's small kitchen table. The first was to her aunt. It was polite and brief and thanked Mrs. Hollis for her charity of the past year, and said that Marin felt it best to remove herself from the burden of the household. She did not mention Prudence. She did not need to. The second letter she wrote more slowly. It was to the Duke. It said only that she would be unable to accept the Wednesday carriage any longer, that she remained sensible of his great kindness, and that she hoped Master Tobias would understand. She signed it Marin Ashcombe, and did not add anything else. She sealed both letters and gave them to the boy who carried the post, and paid him a penny out of her small store of coins. She thought that would be the end of it. She was wrong. The Duke, when he received her letter, read it twice at his desk in his study. He was a man who had trained himself, over many years, to receive news of any kind without visible reaction. He set the letter down. He steepled his fingers under his chin. He looked out at the wet lawn and the copper oaks. He sat like that for a long time. Then he rang for Mrs. Halley. "Something has happened," he said when she came in. "In the Hollis house. To Miss Ashcombe. Find out what it was." Mrs. Halley had her ways. Servants talked. Kitchen maids in one house had sisters in another. By the following afternoon, Mrs. Halley was standing again in the study, and she was telling the Duke, in a voice carefully drained of feeling, exactly what Prudence had said across the candles in her mother's dining room. The Duke listened. When Mrs. Halley finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Thank you, Mrs. Halley. That will be all." He sat alone at his desk after she had gone. He did not move for some time. He was not, as Mrs. Halley might have supposed, angry in any hot, bright way. He had gone very cold and very still, in the way a man goes cold and still when he has just seen a problem laid out clearly and has begun the slow, careful work of solving it. He was a duke. He had spent his whole life solving problems. He was not sentimental. He was practical. And it was very clear to him, sitting there in the fading afternoon light, that a woman who had walked into a flooded river to save his son from drowning had been made to feel small at a dinner table by a woman who had never done a single brave thing in her life, and that this was a state of affairs he did not intend to allow to continue. He rose. He rang for his valet. He dressed for riding. Within the hour he was on the road. He did not go to Mrs. Hollis's house. He went to Mrs. Penrose's cottage. It took him a while to find it. He asked directions of a woman at a pump. She stared up at him, at his fine coat and his tall grey horse and the crest on his saddle, and she pointed with a shaking hand. He thanked her gravely and rode on. He tied his horse to Mrs. Penrose's crooked gate. He knocked at the low door. Mrs. Penrose, when she opened it, forgot to curtsy for a full 3 breaths. Then she remembered and curtsied so deeply she nearly went over. "Your Grace, Mrs. Penrose, forgive the intrusion. Is Miss Ashcombe here?" She was. She had been mending a sheet in the small back room. She came into the kitchen with the needle still in her hand, and stopped in the doorway when she saw who was standing in it. "Your Grace, Miss Ashcombe, I received your letter. I have come to reply to it in person, if you will permit me." Mrs. Penrose, who was quicker than she looked, muttered something about the pig and disappeared out the back door. The Duke and Marin stood in the small kitchen with a low fire crackling and the smell of wet peat in the air, and neither of them spoke for a moment. The needle in Marin's hand caught the light. "You should not be here, Your Grace." "Perhaps not. I am here anyway. I have taken up too much of your household's time already. I did not want." Miss Ashcombe. She stopped. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. I know what was said to you, he said, in your aunt's house. About wet skirts and dukes. Her face went hot. She looked down at the needle. It does not matter. It matters. Your Grace. It matters, Miss Ashcombe. It matters because it was said, and it was cruel, and it was untrue. And it matters because you left your aunt's house rather than say a word in your own defense, and I have thought about that all day, and I find I cannot stop thinking about it. She did not look up. There was nothing to say. There was a great deal to say. You chose not to say it. That is different. She was quiet. He stood very still by the door. The fire snapped in the grate. Somewhere outside, Mrs. Penrose's pig grunted. "May I sit down?" he asked. She nodded. He drew out one of the 2 wooden chairs at Mrs. Penrose's small table and sat. He did not remove his gloves. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up at her. When Tobias was born, he said, his mother was very ill. She lived 4 years after him. In those 4 years she was kind to him, and she loved him, and she taught him his letters, and then she died. I was in Spain when it happened. I was fighting a war I did not much believe in. I came home a widower with a 4-year-old boy who had watched his mother die, and I did not know what to do with him. And so I hired nurses, and I sat in my study, and I told myself I was being a father because I was in the same house. That was 2 years ago. She had lowered the needle. She was watching him now. For 2 years, he said, I have watched my son learn not to expect anything from me. Not because I did not love him. Because I did not know how to show him that I did. And then a woman I had never met walked into a flooded river and pulled him out of it, and when he woke up he asked for her, not for me, and I understood that day that I had made a mistake I might not know how to unmake. Your Grace, he loves you. He speaks of you constantly. I know. That is more than I have earned. He paused. You have been coming to my house for 7 weeks. In those weeks I have watched my son laugh in a way I had not heard him laugh since his mother died. I have watched him sit in your lap and tell you the small, foolish things a child tells someone he trusts entirely. I do not thank you for saving him from the water only. I thank you for what you have done in my nursery on Wednesday afternoons, which I could not have done myself. She could not speak. Her eyes had filled. She looked down at her hands so he would not see. I did not come here today to ask you to come back to Renmer as a visitor, he said. I came to ask you something else. I have thought about it carefully. I did not decide it lightly. I am not a man who does anything lightly, as I think you know. She looked up. He was watching her with that same steady, heavy gaze. I would like you to consider becoming my wife. The fire snapped. A log fell. She heard it as if from a great distance. Your Grace. I know how this sounds. I know what will be said. I know what your cousin said last night at her mother's table. I do not care what will be said. I care what is true. What is true is that I have watched you for 7 weeks, and I have watched you for longer than that if I count the moment you stood on my landing dripping wet with my son in your arms, and I have not, in all that watching, seen you perform a single thing. Not a single thing. You are the only person of my acquaintance of whom I can say that. You do not need me. That is what I keep coming back to. You do not need me. And yet I find that I would like very much to give you a home in which you would not need anyone ever again. She sat down. Her legs would not hold her. She sat on the second wooden chair opposite him. Her hands were shaking again, as they had shaken by the river, and she pressed them flat against the table to still them. Your Grace, I am a parson's daughter. I know what you are. I have no dowry. I have no connections. I have both. Neither has made me happy. People will say, yes, he leaned forward slightly. Miss Ashcombe, I did not ask you for an answer today. I asked you to consider. I am aware that I am at this moment sitting in a cottage kitchen making an offer to a young woman who has not eaten a proper dinner in a day and has just left her only home in the world with nowhere to go but here. I am aware that this is not a fair time to ask you anything. I have asked anyway, because I did not want another day to pass in which you thought yourself alone. Do you understand me? She nodded. She could not speak. Take a week, he said. Take a month. if you need it. Stay here with Mrs. Penrose. I will send whatever you require. If your answer is no, I will accept it. And I will send the carriage on Wednesdays anyway for Tobias, if you will still come to him. If your answer is yes. He paused. If your answer is yes. Then I promise you that no one in this county will ever again speak of you as your cousin spoke of you last night, and that I will be, from that day forward, as good a man to you as I know how to be. She looked at him across the little table. She looked at the fine wool of his coat and the grey at his temples and the lines around his mouth, and she looked at his eyes, which were tired and steady and completely honest, and she thought about her father, who had loved her mother very much, and had told her once that a good marriage was not two people falling into each other, but two people walking in the same direction. And she thought about a small blue coat sinking into brown water, and she thought about herself standing at the edge of the bridge on the morning of the storm, believing that no one in the world was much watching her. I do not need a week, Your Grace. He went very still. I do not need a week, she said again. I have been thinking, since I read your letters, that I did not know what I was going to do next, and I have been thinking, since I sat down in this kitchen this morning, that I have been very lonely for a very long time, and that I did not know it. And I have been thinking, since you sat down in that chair, that you are the only man I have ever spoken with who has looked at me and told me what he saw and not what he expected to see. She stopped. She swallowed. She made herself say the rest. Yes, if you are certain, then yes. My answer is yes. He did not move for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes. He opened them. He reached across the small table and took her hand. He held it as he had held it in the great hall and again by the carriage, 1 moment longer than politeness required, and this time he did not let go. I am certain, he said. I was certain when I rode out this afternoon. He stayed for another half-hour. They did not speak of very much. He drank a cup of Mrs. Penrose's thin tea and complimented it gravely. He said he would send Mrs. Halley in the morning with everything Merrin might need. He said he would ride himself to Mrs. Hollis's house within the week and inform her of the engagement, and he said this in a voice that made Merrin almost feel sorry for her aunt. He said that he would like the wedding, if she agreed, to be small and soon, in the chapel at Renmer, with no more guests than could sit comfortably in the front pews. She agreed to all of it. When he rose to leave, he lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, briefly, formally, and then he was gone, and she was left standing in Mrs. Penrose's kitchen with her heart beating in her ears, and the sound of his horse's hooves fading down the lane. Mrs. Penrose came back inside a moment later. She looked at Merrin's face. She sat down heavily in the chair the Duke had just left. Well, she said. My word. Word travelled. It always did. By the end of the week. Everyone in 3 parishes knew that the Duke of Renmere was to marry the parson's daughter who had pulled his son from the river. Some said it was a fairy story. Some said it was disgraceful. Some said it was the most sensible thing the Duke had ever done. Mrs. Hollis, when the Duke arrived at her house on the 3rd day and asked to speak with her privately in her own parlour, went white and then red, and then a strange grey colour, and afterwards she said very little for 2 entire days, and when at last she spoke, she said only that of course she had always been very fond of dear Merrin, and that Merrin must come home at once and be married from Mrs. Hollis's own house. And the Duke, when he heard of this offer, laughed once, quietly, and said that Miss Ashcombe would be married from Renmere, and Miss Ashcombe would please herself. Prudence, it was noted, was not present at any of these conversations. Prudence had gone very suddenly to visit an aunt in Bath. She was not seen in the county for a long time. There was one story, in those weeks before the wedding, that Merrin heard by accident, and that stayed with her. She heard it from Peggy, the kind maid who had helped her out of her wet clothes on the night of the storm. Peggy told it to her while she was pinning up Merrin's hair for a fitting. You know, miss, Peggy said, about young Ned in the stable. I do not think I do. Barrow's grandson, miss. He is 9. He was living with Barrow. His mother died 2 years back and there was no one else. When Barrow was lost, the boy had nowhere. He thought he would be turned out. His Grace called him into the study the day after the funeral. Nobody heard what was said, only that when the boy came out he was crying, but not sad crying, miss, different. His Grace has settled a sum on him. Enough to see him schooled. He is to go to a proper school in the spring. His Grace never said a word of it to anyone. We only know because the housekeeper of His Grace's man of business let slip to Mrs. Halley. His Grace does not know we know. Miss, I would not have said only. Peggy paused with a pin between her lips. Only I thought you should know the sort of man you are marrying. Maren said nothing. She looked at her own face in the small silver mirror on the dressing table. She looked at it for a long time. Later that afternoon she walked in the garden with the Duke, and he did not mention the boy in the stable, and she did not either, and she took his arm when he offered it, and she felt the strength of it under her hand, and she thought, "This is the man. This is the man." And she was not afraid. They were married on a bright cold morning in December, in the small stone chapel at Renmere. The chapel smelled of pine boughs and beeswax. There were perhaps 30 guests. Mrs. Hollis was there, and 3 of her daughters, and the vicar of Maren's home parish who had known her father, and Corbin, and Mrs. Halley, and Peggy, and Dr. Weld, and every senior servant of the house. Tobias stood at his father's side in a small dark coat, and held the ring on a cushion with tremendous seriousness, and did not drop it. The vicar's wife wept quietly through the whole service, which was, Mrs. Halley said afterwards, the only proper way to conduct oneself at a wedding. Maren wore a gown of soft blue wool. She had made it herself, out of the length of cloth the Duke had sent home with her in that first basket after the storm. She had not told him this. He noticed anyway. When she walked down the short aisle toward him, he looked at the colour of her gown, and something moved in his face that had not moved before, and she saw him understand, and she saw him not say anything about it, and she loved him for that as much as for anything else he had ever done. After the service, in the great hall, when the small crowd had drunk their wine and eaten their cake, and been ushered away to their carriages, the Duke and Maren stood alone together for the first time as husband and wife. Tobias had been carried up to bed asleep on Peggy's shoulder. Mrs. Halley had, with great firmness, closed all the doors. The fire burned in the great fireplace. The candles had been lit against the early winter dark. He turned to her. He took both her hands in his. He looked down at her for a long moment. "Maren, yes, I said in Mrs. Penrose's kitchen that I would be as good a man to you as I know how to be. I want to say it here as well, where you can hold me to it. I know you will. I have not said, in all these weeks. I know. I am going to say it now." He said it. He said it plainly, in a voice pitched only for her, and she heard every word of it, and she would remember every word of it for the rest of her life, and it is not necessary to write here what he said, because it belonged to them. When he had finished, she stood up on her toes and kissed him. It was not a long kiss. It was not a showy one. It was a kiss that said, "I am here, and I am staying, and I know what you are giving me, and I will give it back for every day of my life." When she stepped back, his hand stayed on her waist for a moment, and then he drew her against his chest. And he held her there in the great hall of his house, while the candles burned, and the winter wind rattled the tall windows, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them needed to. A year later, on a warm afternoon in early autumn, a visitor was shown through the gardens of Renmere, and out to a low wall at the far end of the Rose Walk. There, on a bench in the sun, sat the Duchess of Renmere with a book in her lap. She was not reading it. She was watching, with a small, quiet smile, her husband and her stepson at the far end of the lawn. The boy, taller now, was showing his father how far he could throw a stick for a spaniel puppy that had recently taken up residence in the house. The Duke was laughing. He was actually laughing. A low, rough sound that carried across the grass, and the boy was laughing too, and the puppy was falling over its own feet in the wet grass, and the whole scene, to the visitor, looked so ordinary and so warm that she could not quite believe she was standing in a duke's garden at all. The Duchess rose when she saw the visitor. She had a slight, gentle roundness at her waist now that she had not had a year ago, and she moved with the careful, pleased slowness of a woman carrying a first child. She held out both her hands. "Mrs. Penrose, you came. Your Grace." The old woman curtsied as best she could, and Maren caught her elbows and lifted her up and kissed her cheek. "None of that. Come and sit. There is tea." There is always tea, Gideon insists. They sat on the bench together. Mrs. Penrose looked at the Duchess for a long moment. You look well, my dear. I am well. You look happy. I am happy. Mrs. Penrose nodded slowly. She looked out across the lawn at the Duke and the boy and the puppy, and she said half to herself, "It is a strange thing, what one day in a storm can do." Merrin followed her gaze. Her husband, at the far end of the grass, had lifted his son onto his shoulders. The boy was shrieking with delight. The Duke turned toward the bench, as if he had felt her looking at him, and their eyes met across the long green stretch of the garden, and he lifted one hand in a small quiet salute, and she lifted hers back. "Yes," she said softly. "It is." The wind moved through the roses. Somewhere in the house a clock struck the hour, and the sound of it came out to them faint and clear across the warm afternoon, and Merrin Ashcombe, who had once been an invisible young woman standing alone at the edge of a stone bridge in the rain, closed her eyes for a moment and felt the sun on her face, and knew, all the way down to the bones of her, that she was home. And that was how a river that had meant to take a child instead gave back a whole life, and how a woman who had once believed no one was watching came at last to be seen, and chosen, and loved for every quiet, brave thing she was.